This is BS. This is BS. Why are we here? I am gonna call corporate.
Who the hell gave this guy a video camera? Welcome, I guess, into another edition of BSing with Big Nate. Good luck.
dotted line. And at the end of our days, my soul's no longer one. I'm trading all for gold. My heart is feeling cold. It's the end of our days and it's way too late. We're you can't break free.
Dying Oath, End of Days, right here on BS with Big Nate. Of course, last month we started something, and we're going to keep it rolling. It's another edition of what I'm calling, unless she can think of a better name, Mindy's Macabre Movie Madness.
I love it.
All right, we'll roll with that then for now. So Mindy and I tasked each other with watching a movie this week. And in my defense, the movie I gave her, I'm pretty sure she's probably seen it before, but it's one of my all-time favorites. And she gave me a movie as well, which shockingly I had never seen before, and I really regret that, and we'll talk about that more in a minute. But I tasked her with watching The Fog, John Carpenter flick from 1980, and then I had to watch Christine. I didn't have to, but I enjoyed it.
Good.
And so we're gonna dig into those and some of John Carpenter's legacy here on this one. The lesser known films, of course, everyone knows Halloween. Let's go ahead and we'll start with The Fog. I know you'd probably seen it before, but upon rewatching, what were your thoughts? What sticks out to you?
Well, watching it the first time, way, way younger, it was a lot scarier then, obviously, but nowadays there were a lot of parts that were super cheesy, which I also love, especially for 80s horror flicks. But still a great movie. I think it stands the test of time for sure.
So if you haven't seen The Fog, I'll go ahead and I'll give the synopsis because that's probably a little important. And it's even super kind of 80s and cheesy. An unearthly fog rolls into a small coastal town exactly 100 years after a ship mysteriously sank in its waters. And the reason I kind of fell in love with this movie, first of all, it deals heavily with a radio station. So naturally, that's something that I would kind of gravitate towards. But the other thing worth noting is it feels like a Scooby-Doo John Carpenter flick.
It does. Yeah.
Because you never actually see the villains you're dealing with. You kind of see their shadowy outline, and it's just very cheesy.
It is.
The other thing that stands out, and I think maybe it's why you chose Christine as the other one, John Carpenter, whatever he does, just has this very like atmospheric touch, but he also has his hands on everything.
Yeah, that's a great way to describe it. And especially with like The Fog. I mean, you've got like all stars, and Jamie Lee Curtis. I mean, come on. Amazing.
Jamie Lee, I mean, of course, Halloween coming out before that, we already knew that Jamie Lee Curtis kind of had her acting chops and her ability to be this anchor in a horror movie. Anchor, that's it's a weird choice for a movie about a ghost ship.
Ironic.
Now this one, of course, has been remade. Something that we kind of deal with is this revamping of our 80s staples. Have you seen the remake?
I have. It was good, but it's kind of like you said when we were talking earlier. When they redo things, they're still good, but it doesn't have that atmospheric feel that it did when you were a kid and you watched it for the first time. It was good though.
That's another takeaway is now we're at a point where technology kind of does everything for us. In the 80s, you kind of had CG starting to roll in, not in the early 80s, which is when The Fog was released. The practical effects, I mean, you know damn well they were working with real smoke machines and playing around with the lights. And there's a sort of like mystical quality about everything.
I agree, especially like the fog creatures toward the end. It's like I want to know so badly what they actually looked like.
Oh, I mean, that had to have all been. And I should have researched beforehand who did the lighting and the digital effects, but it definitely holds up, I think, which is something that you don't run into necessarily. You can go back. One that stands out to me, The Mummy 2, when the Scorpion King shows up. That is some of the worst CG I've ever seen.
I agree.
And it kind of takes you out of it. Whereas with something like The Fog, where they're using those practical effects, yes, they kind of look dated and not as good as they could have been, but they still very much so hold up. This is something we're going to run into with Christine as well. We'll talk about that in a minute, but I'm just impressed at the way they were able to capture everything.
I agree. If you really sit and think about how they must have had to do everything by hand, it's pretty crazy to think about.
So we're talking about now. This is your rewatch of The Fog. When did you originally see it?
The remake, I saw it like when it first came out because I was kind of excited to see what changed in the movie and what stayed the same and whatnot. But I mean, I was happy with it, but it just wasn't, I don't know. I don't ever think that remakes are ever the same, ever.
Yeah, I'm hard pressed. Has there ever been a circumstance where you've seen a remake, after the fact, and then watched the original and kind of been like, yeah, I'm not, it's not working for me?
A lot of times, really. Like I said, remakes are just, I mean, they're good because they have better effects and things like that for the most part. But you just can't get that same feeling as when you saw it the first time. And we were talking earlier about like My Bloody Valentine. I loved the remake, but the old one just did it for me. You just can't get that same feeling the second time.
I also wonder if a lot of it, because at that point they were still using 72 millimeter, 35 millimeter. They were still using film, whereas for the last 3 decades or so, everything's been largely digital. So I wonder if that kind of contributes to the ambience to it, because particularly with A, The Fog, and B, My Bloody Valentine, it's a much darker picture.
Oh yeah.
Like everything's digitally touched up in the remakes. And I mean, granted, yes, you want your audience to be able to see, but there's something about the monster that lurks in the darkness.
Absolutely. Yeah, it does have that dark feel to it. I think that maybe that's what attracts me to it so much.
No, I think you're absolutely right. Now, before we move on to Christine, which I'm really excited to talk about, and I have to own some shame there, I do want to go ahead and rate it. I believe we decided on a scale of 10 hatchets.
Yes.
How many hatchets would you give The Fog?
Well, because of Jamie Lee Curtis, and I love her, and the fact that it is John Carpenter, which is something I'm also a huge fan of, and the dark ambiance behind it, I'm gonna go 8 with it. I mean, I know it's cheesy, but I love the cheese, man. I do. It's a really great film.
8's respectable. I think it holds up. If you have the opportunity, anyone out there, you should definitely watch The Fog. And you're not going to hurt yourself by watching the remake. It's not going to be as good, but it's pretty solid. I'd probably give that closer to a 7. But we've got to move along to Christine, another John Carpenter flick. And yeah, I don't know how I missed this one. You suggested it, and I was like, yeah, I never saw it. And I was like, all right, well, I guess it's time to point it. But you did give me the option. You said My Bloody Valentine or Christine. And I was like, well, I've seen My Bloody Valentine 1,000 times. Guess I got to get around to watching Christine. And I'm really pissed off at myself for taking so long to actually see it. Essentially, I don't want to give away too much because it's kind of vague, because it's about a car. And it kind of has an impact on its new owner. Of course, anyone who's familiar with James Dean and his death and the car was allegedly cursed, I think there's definitely a lot of influence there with Little Bastard. But to me, and I'm just going to give my first impression, it felt like John Carpenter and Stephen King. Keep in mind, the book came out like 7 months before the movie. It feels like they both just simultaneously watched Jaws and said, hey, what if the shark were a car?
Yeah, I agree.
So why did you choose Christine?
I think it's one of those movies that, once again, when I was younger and I watched it, it just had this effect on me. Like, to the point where, you know, I was young, and so after I got into a car after that point, because my parents had muscle cars, they were racers, street racers. And so every time after that point, I kind of like went out and looked at the car like, hmm, you know, it just had this weird effect on me, and it made me think about things in a different light. But it's another cheesy movie for you.
It was, and it very much, I kind of appreciated it. It had a little bit of it all. First of all, I want to talk about the secondary villain. You can make arguments that Arnie's the villain. You can make arguments that the car is the villain. But the secondary villain is definitely Buddy Repperton.
Yeah.
Yeah, the dude with the switchblade. I have a lot of questions about him. Like, I know this happens a lot. There's a casting call for, you know, we need someone who can play 15 to 25. He could play 35 to 40, maybe. He looked way too damn old to be in high school. So it's no wonder that he had a switchblade.
Because he'd been in 10th grade for like 10 years.
He's just never going anywhere in his life. That being said, I think the if you want to go on a very base level without any character development as to why Buddy hates Arnie, at the very base level, they definitely established that conflict real early. They also very much so hammed up the stereotypical Arnie's a nerd who like can't do anything for himself. He's got his overbearing mother. And that development throughout the movie where Arnie turns from this like nerdy dude and frankly kind of an asshole.
Yeah.
And the whole time I'm thinking, why isn't his buddy just saying, look, you know, I'm done with you. You're kind of a nightmare.
Right? I wondered that the first 2 or 3 times I watched the movie. I've seen it a few times, but
He was so sweet to Arnie. And their friendship made no sense. And if anything, that's kind of what I want to know more about is why they're best friends. Like, it seems like one of those Arnie saved his life somehow, and now he feels indebted. Because on paper, it doesn't make any sense.
yeah, there's definitely something there that they're not telling us. There has to be. It's so toxic.
It really is. So the other thing that we kind of mentioned with the fog is practical effects. That car was burned, beaten to hell, and I mean, we actually see it on screen as the car heals itself. And still to this day, I'm trying to figure out how they did it. Because
That's
now it would have been a CGI effect.
That is such a great question. You know, hadn't really thought about it, but
The
yeah,
only
we're
thing
gonna have to figure that out.
I had to replay it several times. The only thing I can think of is maybe they shot it in reverse and they destroyed the car and then reversed the film. But
That has to be it. It has to be because all the things that they did to it, I don't know. That's crazy. We got to figure that out.
we've really got to do some science here or research rather. Another thing that impresses me about this one is as I mentioned, the book came out early 1983. The movie came out late 1983. That would never happen now. It would spend forever in development hell. So do you think studios at that point, because you got Halloween, The Fog, The Thing, at that point, do you think studios are just throwing money at John Carpenter?
I mean, they'd be stupid not to.
Go do whatever the hell you want, man.
Yeah, he probably had like the idea for the movie maybe as he was writing it, he was probably like, oh, this is going to be an awesome movie. And he was probably already talking to people about it. He's like, hey, I've got this really cool thing coming. And because he was John Carpenter, they were like, okay, take my money.
So another thing that stands out about John Carpenter films is that he is very largely involved with the music selection. Kind of like Quentin Tarantino is big on this too, is that hands-on mentality about the importance of music and setting that mood and that atmosphere. You don't necessarily get a lot of those John Carpenter, like the Halloween theme keyboard, but you do it very impactful scenes. Like there's one when Dennis gets tackled and ends up ending his football career. And there's another, like the first time you see the car Christine. But he also blends it really well, I think, with some of the oldies. And of course, you saw that in Halloween with Mr. Sandman.
Oh, yeah.
So is there something to where previous generations were really into these songs and now to us, there's just like, this is really traumatic. This song is horrifying. Do you know what happened to this song?
That's a good point. That is a really good point. Because I feel like at the time it was probably just something that, people just enjoyed, just normal songs they heard on the radio. But now to us, it's like we associate that with trauma and PTSD.
And another thing that I think the movie was very clear on, and I don't understand, this is kind of a plot point. This is a sticking point for me. The car very clearly has an effect on Arnie. And it also has that impact and that mood on everyone in his life. Do you think it's possible, because the windows are very tinted, you can't tell what's going on. Do you think it's possible that for any of those atrocities the car committed, that Arnie was actually behind the wheel? Because he had gone pretty far off the rails. Like, he obviously had an alibi for when the only person who was like really nice to him, but also kind of a douchebag, was killed the owner of the garage, Darnell. He didn't really deserve to die.
It's true. I mean, it's possible. It's absolutely possible. If you go back and watch through the movie, I mean, that's a really good point.
There's no motive to kill him. However, there is a motive to kill the guys who vandalized and basically trashed his car.
Oh, yeah.
So I've just got to wonder how much was the car and how much was him. Some weird, like, it's almost like Venom from the Spider-Man comics. There's this weird, like, symbiotic relationship. And I think Arnie might have been behind the wheel for at least one of those murders.
I'll have to agree with that. At least one of them.
Because I can only find one clear established alibi in the entire movie. So,
wow. Yeah, you always think about things that nobody else thinks about. That's why I love doing this with you, because you make me think about things that I hadn't thought of, even though I've seen this movie like 20,000 times.
All right, so I suppose you're going to have to go back and rewatch after this, but I suppose we better go ahead and rate this thing. Of course, we're out of 10 hatchets. I'll let you go first because you're the one who chose it.
This is one of those personal movies for me again. I'm going to go an 8 with this one. I never do 10s usually. I would probably do a 9 if there were a lot of other things that did make sense. If there weren't just certain parts that you're just like, what the hell, but as far as like everything goes for effects and storyline and things like that, I think it was pretty good.
So what parts of it hold you back from a 9?
It's just another one of those cheesy horror films. Like for me, like I really love the 80s. I grew up in the 80s and I love those movies. And probably back then I would have given a lot of them a 9. But nowadays there's just there's so many better plots and so many better effects and whatnot. So those are probably gonna be the 9s for me.
Okay. All right. That's fair. This one, speaking of, actually does get a 9 for me. I'm really ashamed I'd never seen it before, because outside of Maximum Overdrive, every Stephen King movie I've seen, it has been phenomenal. Again, Maximum Overdrive, Stephen King was coked out of his mind, and it was his first go at directing, and probably shouldn't have been handed all the funding it was. A dude lost his eye on the set of that movie, like legitimately lost it. So Maybe we'll have to talk about
It's
that
really
one.
funny that you match it. You're talking about Maximum Overdrive, because one of the guys from that movie, Pat, actually lives right up the road from me. He signed my copy, and he's a big to do guy around here.
I did not know that. Who was he in the movie?
He was one of the truck drivers in the beginning.
That's
He
fascinating.
played-
I mean, that's right here in Virginia.
Yeah, he played in a lot of cool movies back then. But yeah, Pat, if you look at the credits to see, what character he played and everything, yeah, Pat Miller lives right up the street from us. So.
And we're gonna have to track him down and get his stories behind the scenes on Maximum Overdrive. All right, so of course, John Carpenter, a big impact on the '80s. I think he's up there with all the other masters of horror. You've got him. You've got uh, Wes Craven.
Oh yeah.
Stephen King, of course, had the success with Creepshow and all of his writing. Maybe we talk about Clive Barker, another great writer who was coming to fruition in the '80s, and that's kind of why I want to segue to this, is just the legacy of movies that came out of the '80s that still to this day horrify me. Sam Raimi, before he was directing Spider-Man, was also making horror movies. So maybe we want to talk about some movies to recommend to people to dig out of their basements, cellars.
Well, we were talking earlier, and if anybody needs to watch a really good '80s movie, for me, probably, like I said, probably my top is definitely Hellraiser. I mean, I love that movie so much.
Hellraiser not only had the gore and the horror, I think it had one of the finest scripts to come out of the '80s.
Definitely.
I think that can be purely attributed to Clive Barker's success as a horror writer. Stephen King, his dialogue, his writing is much more digestible. Clive Barker kind of gets more deep with it. And I think that's what makes Hellraiser such an impactful film. For instance, the one that always stands out to me is in that movie, lead Cenobite is what he's called. He would, of course, become what we all know and love as Pinhead. Makes one of the ultimate threats I've ever heard. It's your suffering will be legendary even in hell. And that's still to me just burned into my brain. That line is just super impactful. Another one, and I guess I can give you your watching plans on a Sunday evening. Of course, you got your Friday the 13th. Those are always classic. Throw one of those in. You'll have a good time. If you've not seen the original Evil Dead, I think you're doing yourself a great disservice.
Mm-hmm.
It was very much made on a very low budget. As far as practical effects go, they were using nothing but practical effects, and none of them are particularly great. But as a cult classic, Evil Dead, easily one of the greatest horror movies. And I mean, do we ever really, because it deals with like a lot of cursed objects and the forest comes alive. Do we ever actually get a real motive behind anything? I don't think we do.
I don't think so. No, I think it just
Barely an origin story. They just kind of find the reel-to-reel tape and then they play it and it reads the spell, but there's no real explanation behind the Book of the Dead.
No, it's just kind of one of those things.
Found in skin, and we accept this as fact.
Yeah.
So give Evil Dead a watch. Give Hellraiser a watch. And Mindy, what is going on in the Dying Oath world?
Well, currently, we have tons of shows, and Blue Ridge Rock Fest being one of those, Metal in the Mountains, a lot of festivals. But right now, we're actually taking auditions for vocalists. So if anybody in the sound of my voice wants to come and try out, please do that, because I'm pulling double duty right now, which I'll do forever if I have to. But I love the dynamic. So now that Jeb is no longer with us, he'll still be doing behind the scenes stuff, still part of the family, but we need a vocalist. So call me.
If I could sing, I would, but I'm out. So if you're out there in BS and land, the Dying Oath know that you're ready to take a shot. Mindy, thank you once again for joining me. We'll have to do this again. I would hope for this to become a monthly thing. We're going to find another theme for next month. But again, thank you so much. Give Dying Oath some love. Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. And Mindy, you have a lovely evening.
You too. Thank you for having me.